BADIUCAO, sir. Well, first of all, thank you very much for giving us this interview, coming to Poland and presenting your art. What I see, you are very much trying to interact with reality that we live in. Well, some artists try to make art for the sake of art, but you are trying to tell us something about reality, very much in chronological order, one can say, starting from Tiananmen Square massacre and kind of end of the hopes of democratic China under CCP. But you were not around, like you were 3 years old at the time when these dreams happened. So what brought you to realizing that this was something interesting?
You know, the Tiananmen massacre is not the only human rights crime that made by the Chinese government. Actually, I am born in a artistic family, and my grandpa and his brother were the first group of filmmakers in China. But in 1957, both of them got persecuted and eventually died because of this political campaign. Have a romantic name, it's called Hundred Blossom, but it's a campaign that's designed to purge artists and intellectuals, or right-wing, as they phrase it. So even for me, that I'm relatively very young, like a toddler in 1989, it does not stopping me to have an understanding of this country from more historic perspective. But what happened in 1989, after I acquired understanding and the knowledge about it, it just completed the puzzle of my understanding of China. So the crime and tragedy does exist in the history, but it continues.
Now, many people say that the Chinese authority or CCP made a deal with the population, saying that you will abstain from politics and we will let you get rich. And do you think that people in China are realizing that this wasn't fair and square deal?
Well, when we talk about the deal, it means you have an equal two parties, right? You have compromising, you have agreement, you have things to bargain with. But what kind of a deal is strike with tanks sent to the square, killing ordinary people? There's no such deal. There is enforcement. There is this illusion that people can have peace of life, maybe getting rich if they remain in silence. But look at China now. What happened to Jack Ma? What happened to all those people who get rich? After the deal, there's no security or protection to civil rights. There's no security or protection to private property. There's no such a deal. It's just lie.
Yeah, well, the Communist Empire, as we know it, and I happen to remember the 4th of June 1989, not on, from my own experience here in Poland. We had obviously a sort of spring of democracy, but we know, or we knew at the moment what is happening in China, that this is an empire of lies. This is a coercion power that wants you to follow them and doesn't want you to object. Yet you are, in your art, praising the idea that individual can stand up towards the power and say, I will not let that happen. Is that something coming from your own experiences?
Well, I think it's always important that we know this propaganda, especially from the communist regime. They want to eliminate the confidence from any individual. They want to tell you that you are insignificant compared with the national machine. And in order to protect yourself, you better behave yourself and be silent. This is their way to control the society, but it's not necessarily representing the truth. That through the history of the world, we see how individuals can actually start and perform social changes again and again and again. And in fact, just last December, there are an entire younger generation brave enough to march on the street again, like those students in 1989. And this time, they're there to demanding the end of the so-called zero COVID policy lockdown. But among this campaign, the requirements from the people are not just about some social or health public management. We also hear the slogan from the protests saying, CCP stepping down, Xi Jinping stepping down. So I do think, you know, for the younger generation, the things is changing. The people knowing that enough is enough. This regime is not sustainable. It's not healthy. It's not successful at all.
Right. But you devoted your art to many things to the issues that were or still are important in the memory of the world, or they are forgotten. Like, for example, the Tibet and taken over by China, repopulating this area when the real Tibetans are now minority, and I don't know if they are allowed to speak their own language. This is something totally obscure. The world doesn't know or doesn't care or doesn't want to know about that. So that's kind of toughy.
Well, it is indeed. Like, we're witnessing the tragedy that happened to the Chinese people, but probably what has been worse happening is to the native or minority groups, like the Tibetans, like the Uyghurs in East Turkestan or Xinjiang. All of their lives are seemed insignificant, actually, to a lot of Western countries. You know, in Germany, Volkswagen was having factories in Xinjiang, regardless of the concentration camps, being torturing more than 1 million Uyghurs.
But as you know about Germany, they have tradition to have such a factories in prison camps.
Well, obviously, they didn't really reflect the history as they try to convince the world. And it's not just Germany. When we talk about America and about other European countries, a lot of corporations are exploring the low human rights record in China in order to getting short-term economic benefits. Yes, in the short term, a lot of people get rich, and they continue want to get back to the Chinese market, regardless all those tragedies has happened. But to what point did the world have to understand this is not sustainable, and in the longer term, you're only feeding the monster grow bigger and bigger. And in the end of the day, now China become a threat, not just to the people who live inside of China, but also around it, far away from it, here in Europe, in Taiwan, Australia, America.
Well, we had the example very recently with the COVID-19 pandemic, that China was active in covering up the wheel, to spreading lies around the world, how this disease come from. Now we know that it comes from the laboratory, military laboratory inside the Wuhan, but the tragedy, the deaths, the pain incurred over the societies all over the world, like wearing this mask and this stuff, that was both irresponsible and dangerous. Yet, China seems to be getting away from that, like nothing happened.
Well, I have to say that I do feel disappointment to the reaction in the free world, the so-called democratic society, right? There are more evidence, as you said, that this virus might be actually artificial, created in the lab. But of course, we don't know if it's released intentionally or from the accident. But what we very clear is that the Chinese government actually knowing the existence of virus way earlier than the whole world is aware of it. And actually, not just the Chinese government is knowing it. There are several doctors try to warn the Chinese society about this new SARS or virus 3 months before the news being break to the world. But what the Chinese government do is arresting them, force them to give a confession saying, okay, there's no such virus, it's a lie, we're spreading the rumors. But what if China is more transparent and democratic? Then it means we would have much longer time to deal with it. Maybe it will be an outbreak regionally. It is not necessary to be a global pandemic.
And you wouldn't coerce the media in America or Europe to deny the epidemics, because we know that the people from China were traveling well into the March of 2020 when everyone knew, including the World Health Organization, that there is an outbreak and the travel from China should be restricted. So that also says a lot about the external influences of CCP.
Well, of course, you know, when we call it a China's Communist Party, we think it's some kind of communist ideology. But it actually amounts to mixed by communist ideology, and they're very good at using capital to control the entire world. Well, I'm glad you mentioned WHO. My personal question and opinion on WHO is how much it is compromised and
100% I can answer you very quickly.
Well, this is my role as an artist is ask questions, and perhaps your role as a journalist is answering those questions. But more importantly, the problem is there's only one voice. When China uses its money to controlling this very important organization that should have the responsibility to warn the entire world, but does it doing its due diligence that achieve its goal? For me, it's a question mark.
Well, we in Poland look at your art and the blend between the present and past. You kind of recreated the picture of Kronos, that Renaissance where you were eating people, and now you have Xi Jinping as a god eating people and Putin as a lesser god eating each other on the opposite sides. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, for me, you know, what happened in China, in Russia, particularly Russia's invasion in Ukraine, is unacceptable. It should never happened in the 20th century. It should never happened when the world has advanced into a much more civilized status. So, you know, for some people, they may argue, oh, this is a hard image to looking at. This is too much for public. But my argument would be we should not look away, because this is the accurate metaphor to showing what's really happened in China and in Ukraine by the Russian invaders.
Right, well, this is a clear violation of everything we've been taught last 50 years, and apparently we've been wrong. But one more question. The CCP and propagandists of the party are saying to the critics that, look, maybe we are not a bunch of angels, but we brought from desperate poverty 1 billion people in 30 years. Like 30 years ago, the people had nothing, were basically starving. Now we are leading in the world economy. Maybe we, you know, not everything is okay, but never in the history of humanity, never ever something like that happened. And what I'm trying to say, do you imagine that democratic China can be next phase in China after that? When the people will realize that you have to take responsibility for your country and govern it in democratic way rather than CCP.
Well, let me come back to the first part that you described about this China's economic miracle. I don't think it never has been done. In fact, I think China's rising in the last 30 years have everything to do with the appeasement and investment from the West. In 1989, this year, a lot of things happened. The Berlin Wall collapsing down, and after several years, Soviet Union actually collapsed. Well, China played a very interesting role in the whole collapsing of Soviet Union because America and the West are seeing China as a potential ally to them in order to kind of against Soviet Union together. And because of that stand, that made China survive 1989's massacre, that nobody really said anything from the democracy. They keep sending the money, investment, technology to China. That is a reason for China's economic growth. So all the credit is not really belong to the Communist Party, but actually belong to the investment from the West.
So you are not really criticizing the CCP, but all you do is criticizing the hypocrisy of the West. that
Well,
sees
you can't-
the murderous, genocidal powers and works with them actively for profit.
Well, the criticism goes both sides, and it's equally important. Let me finish the explanation.
Okay.
So with the foreign investment, that's one thing. But also, China's economic growth was based on crushing, exploiting its labor population. You know how less people are being paid as laborers in China. The whole economic growth, as a country, as a regime, is get rich. But how much money really being reallocated to ordinary people's life? This is something that I think the whole world is overlooking. From my experience, there are still extreme poverties in China. So many cases, not like what UN tried to report, okay, China has lifted the people from the poverty. And if you stay in Shanghai or Beijing or Shenzhen, those mega cities, yes, you see those magic towers being established like New York, like Paris. But if you walk a couple hundred miles away from mega cities, then you see people still living in a very pathetic situation, still living in a very terrible situation.
Oh,
Like last year, there was this very famous case that shocked the entire society in China. There was this woman being human trafficked to a village and being sexually tortured in this very poor village because men in that village do not have enough money to establish a family, to get a wife. So what they do is they buy women from black market. And that is the reality of rural area in China. That is so-called the poverty has been lived. It's not.
Right. The flip side of this one-child policy that for 30 years basically crippled China and future development, right? Because if you don't have children, you will not live. And we know it in the West now. You will learn it very quickly, or you already have this problem. And this also shows how inhumane is the CCP enforcing the ban of second and consecutive children on the families.
Well, this,
for
now,
vague ideology, right? Because somebody told that we are having the population bomb. The Chinese official heard that in the UN, so he returned back to the country and said, we need to introduce the policy and introduce it with the iron fist, which they did, like never, no other country in the world did that.
I think the birth control is the best example to showing how the Chinese government do not see people as human beings, but object. For a very long time, yes, one-child policy. That's because the Chinese government believe, okay, our population is too big. We do not have enough food or money to feed every family. So you have to go through the abortion and everything. But now, giving China become a more aging society, that China will losing the power or the benefit from big young population who can be laborers. It's the end of making China cheap because there's not enough labor anymore. So now the government is starting to encourage and even forcing family to have multiple children.
Well, maybe they will.
You know, it's never about ideology. It's about they do not really see human being as someone that they have to respect. We are tools to them. We are property to them. When they need more people, every family have to have more babies. When they don't need us, every family have to go through abortion or sterilization.
Well, I'm afraid it's summarized not only the China, but also other societies in the world right now, which makes me more grateful for you, for your courage, because standing up for the CCP is not fun, as far as I'm aware. And bringing it here, because it shows us that we are in one world, and the problems in one world are also our problems, and we should think more globally. So, BADIUCAO, thank you very much for this brief interview. I'm really sorry that we don't have more time for this, and this is fantastic insight into the part of Chinese culture that we don't see, that we are not being told about, and hopefully that humanism will win suddenly, maybe even in China. Thank you very much for this.
Pleasure.